Happiness is beautiful, it's a kind reality. Happiness is the highest good, happiness is free. So let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy.
Welcome to the Happiness Show. This is George Ortega, and I'm here to talk about happiness because happiness is, always has been, and always will be the point of it all. Okay, tonight we're going to talk about the second of a series of 3 classic happiness increase experiments that began back in 1977. The first one was conducted by Dr. Fordyce, and I did a show on that one several weeks ago. Now this one is was conducted by a team, Shelley Leichter, Karen Hay, and Richard Kamen, and these are psychologists from the University of Otago in New Zealand. And the experiment was called Increasing Happiness Through Cognitive Training, and it was published in the New Zealand Psychologist, Volume 9 in 1980. Okay, and basically they conducted 2 experiments. The first experiment was really a group discussion. They had their subjects discuss beliefs and attitudes that were related in some ways to happiness. The second experiment involved the subjects rehearsing daily positive feeling statements, self-statements. This is actually the scientific term for affirmations. So, okay, what I'll first do is go through experiment number 1. The premise of this experiment was that that irrational expectations, irrational beliefs, and attitudes bring unhappiness, and that premise is based on psychologist Albert Ellis's theory that feelings, come from the way we evaluate events. That things don't just happen and we'll have an emotional reaction to them. Things will happen, we will evaluate them in a certain way, and then we'll feel an emotional reaction. And this idea actually goes back as far as the Greeks, at least. A philosopher named Epictetus, back in the 1st century A.D., basically said that our emotions really are dependent upon how we evaluate events. Okay, and as a reference for this experiment, they used Wayne Dyer's 1977 book, Your Erroneous Zones. And while this was a popular psychology book and not a classic text or classic psychology source, they felt that the statements that Mr. Dyer, or perhaps Dr. Dyer, included in his book really were very clear statements that described what people think that makes them either happy or unhappy. Okay, so basically the subjects discussed Dyer's list of irrational beliefs. They'd had discussions about them. Now the expectation of the experimenters was that through these discussions the subjects would learn about happiness, what makes us happy and what makes us unhappy, and through this learning they would actually become happier. Now all of the subjects were again tested for their level of happiness before and after the experiment, and these measures, I just want to remind you, have been used for about 40 years, and they are extremely accurate. There's a high correlation between the different kinds of measures that they used, and generally over time they're fairly consistent. Okay, now the subjects ranged from 20 to 60 years old, and they were divided into 2 groups initially. The first was the learning group, who actually took part in the discussions, and the second was a control group who had no treatment. And then actually later, about 12 weeks after the initial experiment, they did a third experiment with that was the subjects were part of the control group and some additional subjects. Okay, so basically 15 items were discussed, and they were discussed during 8 2-hour sessions over a period of 4 weeks. Okay, now each discussion, each item was introduced to the group in a 5-minute introduction, and then the discussions took place for about 20 to 30 minutes, and they basically dealt with practical applications of the topics. Occasional homework assignments were given. For example, like they were asked, well, what makes them angry? And occasionally a role play was used, kind of like to accentuate certain points. Okay, I'm just going to briefly go over the 15 topics that they talked about. Now again, these topics shouldn't be construed as advice. They're just ways that people feel. Some of them are good or wise, some of them are not necessarily. So the 15 topics were, I choose my emotions and feelings, I feel good about myself, my feelings are controlled by other people's approval and disapproval, I believe my personality is fixed, I feel guilty about things I've said or done, I worry about future events, I get angry at people or things that happen, I'm ready to try out new experiences, I can fail at a task without feeling bad, I find fault with others, I'm not afraid to be unconventional when I want to be, I demand I get justice and fairness, I can act independently on my own feelings and beliefs, I am ready to be emotionally open and close to everybody, I enjoy my present moments. Okay, so now after 4 weeks, these subjects were remeasured for happiness, and then 6 weeks later, after the experiment had concluded, the subjects were measured again. Okay, so and again the course was rerun for the second learning group of 16 weeks after the initial group began. Okay, the results were that after 4 weeks of these discussions, the learning group 1 increased their level of happiness by 22%. The control group's level of happiness, as was expected, remained the same. Then, at the 10-week follow-up, 6 weeks after the first experiment concluded, the learning group's level of happiness increased an additional 9%. So in that 10-week time, their happiness increased by about 31%. And again, the control group's level remained the same. Now, what's very interesting actually is that the second learning group that began 16 weeks later, actually after 4 weeks had a happiness increase of 42%. So it really was a very, very effective method for increasing level of happiness in a very, very short amount of time. Okay, I'm going to go through the second experiment, but before I do that, I wrote a song some time ago, and while I didn't write it thinking about Dr. Fordyce in mind, I think I'm going to dedicate this performance to him because he really had the wisdom and the insight to really understand how important it was to demonstrate to the world that happiness increase is relatively easy and simple and quick with just some sustained effort. Okay, so this song is called "The Answer."
There was a man who had a job where he would try to find the answers to some questions set in numbers mathematically. Sometimes he worked for months and months, and everything would seem so futile that he wondered if success would ever come to be. but with faith he persevered and finally worked out his solution, demonstrating once again that every question has an answer, waiting to be freed for all to see. There were a people of a world where sorrow was to be unquestioned. Very few would dare to say, this does not have to be. Till one day came a man of reason who could not be turned away from his conviction that he'd soon find bliss-filled victory. Mocked and subject to derision, sustained by faith in harmony, he asked his question every day in countless ways until the heavens in desperation bowed to grant his plea. From that time on, this world of people lived in joy eternally, with no questions left to ponder, no pain to bear or flee. The moral of all that is this: don't compromise reality. Every question has an answer, and everything that's right will come to be. Yes, every question has an answer, and everything that's right will come to be.
Okay. All right, so now I want to go through the second experiment. This one was conducted solely by Karen Hay, and the premise was that by rehearsing positive self-statements for 2 weeks, again, positive self-statements or affirmations, subjects could raise their level of happiness. And this premise was based on a famous experiment by a psychologist named Emmett Velton, and it was a 1968 experiment where basically he was able to induce moods in subjects, and these moods lasted over a half an hour, and the moods were induced by simply the subjects reciting some statements. You know, if they recited statements that seemed angry, they would become angry. If they recited happy statements, they would become happy. Okay, now this Velton experiment is really a classic in psychology. You know, I was studying happiness through reading various journal articles, and it's really quoted often in the literature. Okay, now the subjects for this experiment were college students, and again, college students are generally chosen for these experiments because they're readily available to the researchers, but the results for college students usually apply to the general population as well. And so there was a treatment group and a control group. And they were given 3 lists of 18 statements that were actually the opposite of statements that are representative of clinical depression. Okay, so the 3 of them basically were the same theme, but one statement was in a mild, the other a medium, and the other a strong form. And I want to give you an example. For example, in the first list, the mild statement might say, I don't consider myself a bad person at all. The second medium statement would say, I think I'm a good sort of person. And the third statement, which is a strong kind, would say, I feel good about myself. Okay, so what I'd like to do is actually just read through the statements so you get an idea of what they were reciting. And these examples that I'm reading are all the strong statements. So the first one is, I feel good about myself. I've got a lot of fine qualities. I'm loved and trusted by those close to me. I'm looking really great today. I have confidence in my decisions. I prefer to make decisions carefully but promptly. Today looks great. I have a feeling that the future is going to bring good things. I have no control over some of life's misfortunes. I accept the fact that I have my weaknesses, but I can do something about them. I can't wait to get started on something. It's better to get unpleasant jobs out of the way right now. I love being alive. Up to a point, I like being independent. I feel great about myself as a person. I get a lot of pleasure out of everything I do. I'm feeling close and loving about the people around me. And the last one is I'm feeling in a great mood. Okay, now the subjects read these statements for 10 minutes each morning for 2 weeks. And they were instructed they could spend as much time on any one statement as they wished within the 10-minute frame period. And before they read these statements, they were instructed to read the following statement. My success will depend on my willingness to be open and to respond to the ideas in each statement. I will allow each idea, each feeling, to act upon me without interference. I will concentrate my full attention on these statements. I will go over each statement again and again in my head with the desire to really believe in it. I will experience each idea and identify myself with it. I will move myself towards holding that same attitude. I will visualize a scene in which I could use these suggestions. I will experience the idea and move further and further into it until I do feel the way the statement suggests. I might even find that memorizing certain statements and saying them to myself during the day will help me. I will train myself into adopting this outlook, this healthy way of thinking, into my everyday life. I will let these suggestions act upon me. I will become a happier person because I am feeling good about myself and my life. I will be able to get myself out of low moods by reading these statements to myself. I will be better able to control my moods. Okay, so then what happened was that both the control groups and the treatment groups that actually did the reading of the self-statements would fill out a questionnaire describing their level of pleasure or happiness each night before they went to sleep. And again, these tests are highly reliable. And the treatment group who read the statements also would describe which group, which list they read from, the mild, medium, or strong list. Okay, so now the subjects, after 2 weeks, the subjects in the treatment group increased their level of happiness by 25%. And this is interesting because this is about the same amount that Dr. Fordyce found in the experiment that I described several weeks ago. Dr. Fordyce's results were within 2 to 6 weeks. Okay, okay. Now on June 5th, I'm going to review the third of these classic happiness increase experiments. And this third experiment was also published by Michael Fordyce 3 years after this one in 1983. Okay, what I'm going to do now is go to our strategies and considerations segment and just go through different suggestions and recommendations on how we can become happier that has been gleaned from the research by psychologists. Actually, this one, although psychologists have demonstrated its efficacy, has been around for a very long time. This has to do with desires, that eliminating or minimizing desires is very effective in helping us to become happier. This of course, was known since the time of Buddha. It's actually a very important part of Buddhism. So the idea here is that we create desires. Like, for example, let's say someone has the desire to win an Olympic gold medal. Okay, so you create this desire, and naturally you work toward it. You might enjoy working toward it, but you may not. And then what happens is, like, if the desire is not fulfilled, well, then a lot of times there's a sadness. There's I guess perhaps an unnecessary sadness. The idea is that without desires, we can have a pleasant state of mind. Now, some desires are fun to work toward, like perhaps winning an Olympic medal, or trying to do really well on the job to get promoted, making money, whatever. People have different desires. Desire to get married, raise children, and so sometimes desires can have positive elements. But the idea is to not make what we want necessary to our happiness. We've got time to devote to various activities each day, and we choose what we want to do. But we should always try to do these things with a kind of a separation from the results or from the desire, a separation between that and our happiness. The less desires we have, the less we want out of life, the easier it's going to be to be happy. Basically, our one desire should probably be to be very happy, because if that's our one desire, we will focus on it, we'll devote much of our effort to it, and probably succeed, and that will render all of our other desires much more insignificant. We'll either have them or not, but it won't matter as long as we're very happy. Okay, the next consideration I want to go through is important, not just, well, it's more important in a global political sense than in a personal sense. Basically, they found that the only situation in life that prevents one from being happy is not having enough food. Starving, being very hungry, not having enough food to sustain one. And so that means, like, being ill, being poor, lacking certain freedoms. There are many kinds of situations that we find ourselves in that aren't the most desirable, but nonetheless the research has demonstrated that we can nevertheless rise above them and feel very happy. However, with not having food, that's the one situation that we haven't been able to, that science has demonstrated that it's basically impossible to overcome. So in terms of our political views of the world, I think this has to do with a lot of countries, a lot of people in the world that really don't have enough to eat. I think there are about 23,000 children that die each day from either malnutrition or starvation. That's about 8 million children under 5 each year. And I think as a world, I think we really should devote a great amount of effort and money to rectifying this. I think, our Constitution gives us the right to pursue happiness, and I think everybody in the world, not just in this country, should have that same right. Sometimes we think that, well, we don't have enough money to do this. It's a task that's way beyond us. But let me just give you a figure that demonstrates that we actually really do have enough. Basically, the foreign aid we give to countries throughout the world amounts to about 1/1000th of 1% of our gross domestic product. Now, our gross domestic product is really the sum of all of our productivity throughout the year. And to put that in some perspective, our military budget next year will exceed that of every other countries in the world put together, and we'll be using just 4% of our gross domestic product to fund our military next year. So really, we're using very little of our resources in our greatest of expenditures. And again, for foreign aid, it's just 1/1000th of 1%. Many people, think, well, we do so much for other people in the world, and sometimes compared to other countries who don't have as much as we do, you know, relative to them we do a lot. But I think compared to what we could do, we really do virtually nothing. And I do believe that the people everywhere, not just in this country, not just in the first world, have a right to pursue happiness, to a chance at happiness, and I think we can give them that right by adequately having our foreign policy reflect, you know, concern that these people at least be given that opportunity. Okay, the next item I'd like to consider is that that liking ourselves and others is very important to our happiness. One of the 4 character traits, personality traits, that's most conducive or correlates mostly with happiness is self-esteem. The more we like ourselves, the more likely it is that we'll be happy. Liking other people is actually very related to another of the 4 personality traits most correlated to happiness, extroversion. When we're extroverted, we spend a lot of time with people, we enjoy them, they enjoy us. So yeah, the theme of this is liking, you know, liking ourselves, liking other people. Liking ourselves, I mean, it's just very wise to do that because we are with ourselves constantly. You know, we're always with ourselves, so it just makes a lot of sense to really like ourselves as much as we can. And when we like others, again, our significant others are generally our main source of happiness. So that, again, is also very wise. Okay, well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thanks for watching. In the future, we'll explore other topics designed to help us better enjoy life. This is George Ortega saying, be good, think well, feel very happy, and I hope you'll join me again next week here on The Happiness Show.
Happiness is powerful, it's our underlying need. Happiness is why we live each day, happiness is destiny. So let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy.